The Kriegsmarine was running out of fighters. Years of fighting had left Hitler with only a few major warships capable of threatening the Allies. And now, his enemies were coming in to deliver the finishing blow. The mission was dangerous enough as it was planned. 3 X-class boats with just enough room to host a crew of 5, going up against Tirpitz, the heaviest Nazi battleship ever built. Now, only 2 submarines would lead the charge. A 3rd submarine had disappeared. Some believe her crew managed to approach the German ship closely enough to deploy a series of charges beneath her belly. But before these could go off, the Nazi sailors above pointed the ship's 105mm guns at the submarine and opened fire. During the operation, however, there was no time to entertain theories. The Germans now knew they were under attack, and the window for the remaining X-craft to take down Tirpitz was closing fast. Submarines X6 and X7 rushed toward the vessel. Every man on board understood they could be the ones to receive the next lethal strike, but they also knew that if they landed their hits just right, they could be the sailors who broke the Kriegsmarine's back. It was late 1943, and for the first time since the war began, victory seemed to be slipping from Hitler's grasp. On the Eastern Front, the Nazis were bleeding men and resources as the Soviets kept pushing them back. Aware that their troops would not be able to hold back the Red Army much longer, the Nazis had started to focus their attention on the seas, going after the Arctic convoys, bringing ammunition, fuel, and industrial equipment to the Soviets. Whenever the Kriegsmarine came for a convoy, ships would release clouds of smoke and launch mock torpedo attacks, forcing the Germans into aggressive maneuvers. Amid the chaos, the Nazis couldn't tell friend from foe, and before they could claim a single successful strike, Nazi sailors often found themselves sailing straight toward the guns of their rivals. Hitler was so furious that Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, commander-in-chief of the Kriegsmarine, had been replaced by Admiral Karl Dönitz. However, after losing about 43 U-boats in a single month to the enemy, the new commander was now on thin ice with the Führer as well. It seemed that the only hope left for the Nazis to maintain their hold over the seas rested on Tirpitz and Scharnhorst, their last 2 operational capital ships. So when X6 and X7 zeroed in on their target and began dropping their charges, every Allied sailor held his breath. The advantage of surprise was slipping away. With every charge dropped beneath Tirpitz, German defenders got closer to landing a direct strike and buying the Kriegsmarine one more day in the battle. Sailors were thrown back and forth as their boats threaded through incoming fire. Soon, the Nazis had their range. Explosions erupted around the submarines, shaking their hulls and battering their crews. Every second that passed increased the odds that the submarines would never make it home, leaving sailors with no choice but to surface and meet Tirpitz's guns face to face. 6 of the 10 men left in the mission were captured, but at least they had managed to complete the job. Sitting beneath Tirpitz was now a minefield of demolition charges, set to go off within the hour. The German vessel was fast, able to push her engines to 30 knots whenever battle called for it. But she had one critical weakness. At 50,000 tons, her acceleration was painfully slow. Even if the Nazis knew the explosion was coming, there was no way to move this beast out of the impact zone in time. The charges were powerful enough to rip through Tirpitz's hull. More than 1,400 tons of seawater poured into the vessel, wrecking electrical systems, flooding fuel tanks, and causing the entire ship to list. The ship wouldn't sink that day, but with this amount of damage, it would take at least half a year before Tirpitz could sail into battle again. While Germany still possessed a handful of major surface warships, including the Panzerschiffe Admiral Scheer and Lützow, with Tirpitz out of commission, there was only one true operational capital ship left in the Kriegsmarine, Scharnhorst. Coming in at 770 feet long and packing more than 20 naval guns, some capable of reaching targets up to 25 miles away, she would be a fearsome opponent. But the Allies couldn't afford to give the Kriegsmarine any time to regroup. Scharnhorst had to go down at once. The Royal Navy knew Scharnhorst was hiding somewhere in Norway, and the only way to lure it out to sea was to offer some of their own sailors as bait. This dangerous task fell upon convoy JW-55B, a formation of 19 merchant vessels departing from Scotland toward the port of Murmansk on Russia's western coast. The pack would be accompanied only by a group of small warships, ensuring that the moment it was spotted by the Germans, they wouldn't feel threatened and second-guess deploying the surface vessels to intercept the convoy. The convoy sailed off on December 20th, 1943. For 2 days, ships sailed dangerously close to Nazi-occupied shores, yet the waters ahead remained calm. The Allies didn't know it yet, but Karl Dönitz had been intentionally allowing convoys to sail undisturbed across the area during the previous few weeks. Some suggest it was part of a German strategy to let the British lower their guard. However, it could also have been that after so many embarrassing defeats at sea, the Admiral wasn't ready to commit his ships to battle just yet. Whatever the case, Hitler was growing impatient, and Dönitz promised that the next time a convoy was spotted passing by, he would make sure to bring it down. So on the 22nd, when a Luftwaffe aircraft spotted JW-55B and relayed its coordinates back to base, Dönitz was ready to send his men into action. He was unaware that by giving Hitler what he wanted, he was only sending his men right into the Royal Navy's trap. Back in Britain, officers were notified that the convoy had been spotted and proceeded to launch the next phase of their plan. Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser, Commander-in-Chief of the Home Fleet, was to leave Scapa Flow and set sail toward the convoy at top speed alongside Force 2, a battle group comprising 4 destroyers, 1 cruiser, and the battleship HMS Duke of York. Still, Fraser had to be careful to keep some distance from the merchant ships ahead. If a German aircraft were to spot his group trailing just behind the convoy, then the Germans might figure out their plan and keep Scharnhorst in port. As convoy JW-55B slowly sailed across the waters off Norway, there was no one in its immediate vicinity to bail it out if anything went wrong. To ensure further protection, or at the very least reduce the chances of Scharnhorst getting away, a second group, known as Force 1, consisting of 3 additional ships and led by Admiral Robert Burnett, was launched from Russia just as the incoming convoy approached the most dangerous area of its journey, sailing between Bear Island and Altenfjord, situated on the northern tip of Norway. The plan could easily turn against the British at any moment. Yet as the convoy drew closer to German positions, everything seemed to be working in the Allies' favor. The Nazis hadn't spotted Force 1 and 2 closing around the convoy, and Karl Dönitz was already preparing to send his own men into action. Initially, the Admiralty was unsure whether or not to commit Scharnhorst. According to reports, the weather was expected to deteriorate in the coming days. Even more troubling, during this time of year, the sun would be up for only a couple of hours each day. By the time his force reached the convoy, visibility could be so poor that ships wouldn't be able to rely on visual signals during the hunt. But the opportunity was just too good to pass up. A slow-moving target, seemingly unprotected and sitting just within his reach. All it would take was a couple of rounds from Scharnhorst to tear this valuable Allied formation apart and redeem himself in the eyes of his Führer. Finally, on December 25th, he gave the all-clear for the capital ship to set sail alongside 5 destroyers. The mission was known as Operation Ostfront. Leading the strike group was Admiral Eric Bay. He was no stranger to high-stakes, fast-paced missions. The previous year, he had helped keep the Scharnhorst alive from British defenses as she dashed through the English Channel in a daring 2-way race back to Germany. However, times were different now. He was aboard one of the last crown jewels of the Kriegsmarine. Defeat would not only mean a crushing humiliation for the Third Reich, but potentially also losing the last chance to turn the tide of the war. As Admiral Bay reached the convoy's reported location, he warned Dönitz that the operation would be difficult. But the Supreme Commander's orders left no room for doubt. Quote, "Exploit the tactical situation skillfully and daringly. Action must not end with partial success." Visibility was even worse than Bay had expected. A growing snowstorm had grounded every Luftwaffe aircraft in the area, and fearing that British ships would spot his vessel if he used radar, the Germans had shut off their tracking systems. Even after a nearby U-boat had reported the convoy's exact location, the Nazi admiral still couldn't pinpoint his target. Bay knew it was foolish to keep Scharnhorst sitting in the water a second longer than necessary, but he couldn't return to port without something to show for it. He gave the order for his destroyers to break away from the formation and scout the area for the convoy. But almost as soon as the vessels disappeared into the haze, communication was lost, and Scharnhorst found herself completely alone, with no idea where to turn next. After more than an hour of patrolling the waters, without any luck spotting either the rest of his pack or the Allied convoy, a ray of light suddenly broke through the mist and descended onto the deck of the German vessel. For a second, it shone as bright as the sun, yet the sailors knew this wasn't the weather giving them a break, but a pack of Royal Navy attackers marking the location with star shells. Force 1 had spotted Bay and closed to within just 7 miles without the Germans noticing. Now, the pack was about to empty its guns into Scharnhorst's hull before the sailors even had a chance to take up battle positions. At the helm of the charge was the heavy cruiser Norfolk, spitting shells from her 203mm guns, which kept inching closer to Scharnhorst with every round. Bay, still struggling to gauge how many enemies were coming at him, barely had time to order his men to deploy a smokescreen and rush south toward Norway. Amid the escape, 2 shells found Scharnhorst through the haze. The admiral called for the ship's 11-inch cannons to be turned toward his enemies in return, but the British strikes had wrecked radar controls. The German sailors resorted to aiming for the muzzle flashes of the British guns. Germans and Brits exchanged gunfire for about half an hour, yet not a single salvo from Scharnhorst managed to find its target. Luckily for Bay, he still had 1 card left to play. He knew his ship was faster than his hunters, so he called for the engines to be pushed to maximum power, escaping the scene just before the British could land the decisive blow. This could have been the time for the capital ship to rush back to port and call it a day. But the Kriegsmarine was in desperate need of a win, and Admiral Bay was certain that if he got his ship into the right position, he could easily outgun all his rivals. He knew it could be the most heroic move of his career, or the dumbest mistake he ever made. Still, Bay turned back north and rushed into the fight once more. The Germans and the British were now rapidly converging on the same area, and whoever spotted the enemy first would gain the edge in the second round of the fight. Admiral Burnett of Force 1 knew his ships couldn't catch up with Scharnhorst, so he decided to stay as close as possible to convoy JW-55B. Radars wouldn't be able to locate the exact course the Germans were taking until they were approaching striking range, but at least the Nazis wouldn't be able to pinpoint the convoy's exact location either. Scharnhorst's radar was still down, and as Admiral Bay approached the Allied position ahead, he was relying mostly on coordinates provided by U-boats that had patrolled the area hours earlier. Further south, Admiral Fraser's Force 2 was doing its best to reach the scene before it was too late to join the fight. Visibility was still poor, but the snowstorm was beginning to give way, and as the clouds above the British ships broke, the crew spotted a single German aircraft passing overhead. They had been seen, and Fraser worried it was only a matter of time before Scharnhorst was ordered back to port. Fortunately for the British, when Bay received reports of the incoming Allied formation, he wasn't informed that a battleship was sailing with the group. So rather than call off the attack, he continued heading north until Admiral Burnett's ships picked up Scharnhorst on their radar screens. Burnett couldn't have known that the Germans were virtually sailing blind, so even though his battle group's guns didn't have the range of Scharnhorst's, and Force 1 was still too far away to carry out an effective torpedo attack, he wasted no time in calling for a second star shell to be launched and every available cannon to open fire at once. The attack succeeded in preventing the Nazis from getting any closer to the convoy ahead, yet it failed to land a strike that could prevent Scharnhorst from turning her own weapons on the British and returning fire. German shells started landing on the cruiser Norfolk, severely damaging one of her gun turrets and filling parts of the ship with smoke. The British sailors attempted to keep the fight going, putting on gas masks and battling flames as the remaining guns continued spitting shells at Scharnhorst, which by now was once again fleeing the scene, using her superior speed to her advantage. The Royal Navy's engines quickly reached their limit, and the Germans were out of danger once again. By now, Admiral Bay had made up his mind. He was no longer willing to risk Scharnhorst, so he turned south and headed toward Norway, determined to reach port. He didn't know that his chance to abort the mission had already passed. Admiral Bay believed he had survived the worst of the battle, but as she rushed toward the safety of the shore ahead, Force 2 was receiving reports of her exact location. Admiral Fraser was now in just the right position to intercept Scharnhorst. As soon as Fraser's destroyers picked up the Germans, he ordered shells to be prepared, but to hold fire until the formation was about 16 miles away from their target, ensuring that the Nazi ship could not escape. Lacking radar once again, Bay couldn't see the enemies closing in on his ship until it was too late. And before Scharnhorst could sail into the safety of the Norwegian fjords ahead, a new round of shells started raining down on her. This time, the strike was delivered by the 14-inch guns of the battleship Duke of York. Admiral Bay tried to maneuver his ship out of the way, yet he couldn't stop one of the incoming shells from landing directly on her forward turret. Almost the entire gun crew was taken out as the explosion went off, unleashing a fire so violent that Bay had to order the compartment holding the stored shells to be flooded, just to prevent them from detonating and splitting the ship in two. The German admiral knew that he would never make it to Norway alive, so he ordered his crew to head back north. However, the moment his ship began to turn, the sailors were met by a new wave of fire. Force 1 had finally caught up with them. Bay was now trapped between two closing walls. To the south, Admiral Fraser's Force 2 continued to block the Germans from reaching port, while to the north, Admiral Burnett's Force 1 prevented Scharnhorst from escaping toward the Barents Sea. Still, he couldn't be remembered as the man who lost one of Hitler's last capital ships. So the Admiral did the only thing he could think of: head east and order flank speed as Scharnhorst kept firing at the hunters closing in on her. Hits kept landing on the German ship's hull, yet she didn't slow down. One of her shells even managed to find the Duke of York, damaging her radar and reducing the accuracy of her guns. Scharnhorst was surrounded by more than a dozen warships, yet she was faster than each of them. As improbable as it was, she seemed poised to escape the Allies once again. As the German vessel started to leave the British behind, Admiral Fraser messaged Force 1's commander and declared, quote, "I see little hope of catching Scharnhorst." After 8 hours of fighting, both sides were reaching their limits. Darkness had swallowed the Arctic. Crews were exhausted, and despite the damage she had taken, Scharnhorst was still pulling away. If the British were going to finish the job, they would have to do it soon. The Germans were still too far ahead, and even with their speed reduced, Admiral Fraser feared they'd never reach them in time. So rather than keep entertaining a worthless pursuit, he instructed his crew to abandon the chase, turn back, and cover the Allied convoy behind them before one of the German destroyers lurking in the area could find it. But not everyone in the formation was ready to let his coveted trophy slip from their grasp so easily. The damage dealt to Scharnhorst would probably be enough to keep the capital ship out of commission for a while, but if the Royal Navy didn't sink her now, Allied sailors would soon be harassed by her guns once again. They couldn't allow the Kriegsmarine to wield that power ever again. A couple of destroyers from the Allied pack kept rushing ahead as fast as their engines would allow, braving the rough waters until they came close enough to Scharnhorst's port side to attempt a torpedo attack. Spotting the destroyers closing in, the Germans opened fire on them. Visibility was still terrible, and heavy seas tossed both sides around, yet Scharnhorst's gunners somehow managed to find their mark. Shells slammed into HMS Saumarez, cutting short the lives of several sailors, as the rest of the crew attempted to swerve out of the line of fire. As the Germans kept trading fire with destroyers positioned on their port side, they couldn't see that another threat was approaching from the opposite side. Hidden by the weather and the glow of star shells launched over the battlefield, the Norwegian destroyers Stord and HMS Scorpion were slipping into position to strike. From barely 2 miles away, the destroyers unleashed 16 torpedoes. Scharnhorst turned hard to avoid them. The maneuver carried the battleship directly into the sights of the destroyer Samaras and her partner, HMS Savage, which then launched an additional dozen torpedoes against Scharnhorst. A series of quick detonations rattled the ship to her core, cutting her speed to barely 10 knots. Even if the crews on board could somehow repair the damage, they wouldn't have enough time to escape the rest of the British formation closing in on them. Admiral Bay knew the battle was lost, but rather than call for an immediate evacuation, he reported back to command, quote, "We shall fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer. Long live Germany." Just 6 miles behind Scharnhorst, Duke of York, now back in action, was getting into position to strike alongside the cruiser Jamaica. Scharnhorst pointed whichever guns remained operational across her deck and set her torpedoes to detonate. The chances of sinking a single one of her executioners was slim, but she was not going down without at least trying to deliver one last blow to the Allies. Backed by a couple of cruisers, Duke of York emptied her guns against the Germans without being struck back once. The moment Admiral Fraser considered Scharnhorst finished, he called for the destroyers Opportune, Virago, Musketeer, and Matchless to push ahead and fire a final round of 19 torpedoes to seal the German vessel's fate. The battle to keep Scharnhorst may have been over, but for the German crew aboard, the final strike would come from the freezing waters waiting for them. As the British formation gathered around the wreckage to pull survivors from the water, only 36 men from the nearly 2,000-strong crew were brought aboard Royal Navy ships. The freezing water claimed sailors faster than they could be recovered. Even Admiral Bay, who was reportedly seen for the last time swimming away from his sinking ship, wouldn't survive long enough to be rescued. This had been a fierce campaign, and not long after the German ship was gone, Admiral Fraser turned to his men and declared, quote, "The battle against Scharnhorst has ended in victory for us. I hope that if any of you are ever called upon to lead a ship into action against an opponent many times superior, you will command your ship as gallantly as Scharnhorst was commanded today." However, this would be one of the last major battleship-on-battleship duels in history. After Scharnhorst's defeat, no German surface formation was ever deployed to hunt Allied convoys again, and while Tirpitz, now the last of Hitler's major battleships, would eventually return to action, it wouldn't take long before Allied bombers brought her down for good. The Kriegsmarine's most powerful ships were gone, and from now on, every passing day was about to get just a little bit harder for German sailors.